We are back. We had a couple technical difficulties earlier, but back with episode 3, Lloyd's podcast. This episode is about the limitations of political participation in the context of Black freedom. I'm here with Miss Valeria Chapman. Do you want to introduce yourself for a second?
Sure. My name is Valeria Sinclair Chapman. I'm a political science professor at Purdue University, and I study minority politics, Congress, and Black political participation.
Okay, sounds good. So, right off the bat, so what do you think are the limitations of political participation in the Black community? We kind of talked about this briefly earlier, but just to see what you still think about that.
Yeah, so I think that voting is the easiest form of political participation. Even though it's a 2-stage process, you have to register before you can actually vote. But all things considered, it takes the least amount of time, money, and effort to vote. Other things take much more effort. So working for a political campaign or donating to a political campaign, boycotting or organizing, attending a rally, and even protesting, right? That takes more time and energy. So in terms of limits, if we think particularly about voting, you have to think about what people wanted when they wanted to vote. And that was to express themselves as citizens, as well as the opportunity to influence policy and policy making, to have representatives that spoke on their behalf. And sometimes that works, but one representative or even 10 representatives, they don't make a majority, and you need a majority of votes in order to get policies passed for your benefit. And so the vote doesn't always translate into the preferred outcomes, particularly when people have smaller numbers than others, and when their opponents are organized or have more resources. So you can think about that for Black people. You can think about it particularly for Black youth, because certainly voting and turnout and is very much related to education, age, and money. And so young people are at a disadvantage there. So voting is limited, but it is still important. And I think that in order to really make change for Black communities, you need an inside-outside strategy where people vote, where they run for office, where they try to write and influence policy, and where people protest as well.
Okay. In my class, we actually talked briefly about the fact that even when Black people are voting, the people that we get into these positions of power aren't making the necessary steps to help the community. And it's not counterproductive, but it's even when we elect and help to push to get people in office, they actually end up doing much for us. Would you say the same thing? Or do you think that we just aren't electing enough people who are being productive when they get in office?
Yeah, no, I would actually disagree, but a lot of people have that view. There's a famous book called We Have No Leaders, and part of the argument for them, or for that author, his name is Robert C. Smith, part of his argument is that Black elected officials just aren't doing enough. They're not radical enough. And that's, I think, a constant critique of Black elected officials. And it could be true. Typically, Black elected officials, from the city council to the halls of Congress, typically they're more liberal than others. Not always. They're typically going to be Democrats, so mostly they're going to be on the right side of the issue. But they're not going to often make up a majority of a legislature, whether it's a city council or county legislature or even when they're in a mayor's office or so on, all the way up to Congress and even the presidency. The presidency, you don't need a majority, but certainly in Congress. And so if you don't have a majority, you're still at a disadvantage. You can be influential, though. So one way to look at it is that black legislators are actually doing more than others would. So black legislators are more likely to sponsor policies that support black communities, anti-poverty, more money spending on education, anti-gun violence, criminal justice reform. Black politicians do that kind of work typically, and they're more likely to do it than others, but it doesn't make them successful. So what you need are majorities, often of Democrats, but even that's not going to be enough because the Democratic Party is not always liberal or supportive of black interest. And so part of that is coalitions. One of the things that we forget that black legislators do is they keep certain things off of the agenda. It's like negative power, and that is, can we stop the worst from happening? And sometimes that's the work that black legislators do. So it makes a difference that they're on these committees, or, even a black mayor. It doesn't make them perfect. I mean, we just had the incident in Baltimore with a black mayor who seemed to be augmenting her salary by, making hospitals and other entities buy her books. That's a problem.
Was this the same guy in Baltimore who Trump condemned? Was this the same one?
Oh, no. But
was this someone
that
else?
was Elijah Cummings. Here I was talking about the mayor was the one that had is having like some fraud charges because she sold, I want to say, $800,000 worth of books to various like hospitals and other things around the state in order to, and those were people who were trying to get her attention so that they could get contracts or other things in Baltimore. She was indicted, I think, today. Okay. But Elijah Cummings was a representative from Baltimore who served in Congress and who chaired the Judiciary Committee, the Oversight Committee in the House of Representatives. And he was from Baltimore. He grew up in Baltimore. And I think he represented the city well. But the kinds of problems that face American cities have been neglected by the Congress for decades, right? They are places where millions and millions and millions of people concentrate, but rural areas often, or suburban areas often have representation that is greater than their numbers, right? Because when you concentrate people and they're all in one district, they still get one legislator or one, just one set of people that represent them. So despite the fact that they have such large numbers, a rural area, you might get 200,000 people in a rural area or a suburban area, and they get a mayor and a city council, right? And they also get a representative. But their districts are different sizes. Mm-hmm. And so, but part of what happens in cities is that we don't necessarily, or the United States federal government has not put the resources into cities that it needs to in education and infrastructure and even in policing and other kinds of things. And so elected officials, mayors and legislators in the Congress and other places, they look like, people blame them a lot because they wish that they could do more. But these legislators or elected officials are actually part of a much larger system that is, for a long time, has neglected urban areas. I mean, if you go back to the 1960s, we had a war on poverty. We had some, at least there were some ideas about moving forward to really change the circumstances of urban areas. There were laws that could help ensure that people that lived in cities had districts that reflected their numbers so that rural areas weren't getting greater representation in urban areas, but still, I think that the United States has a long way to go so that places like Baltimore actually get the resources that they need. But for black legislators, I think that they're not miracle workers, but I think that they're raising the right kinds of issues in Congress, and they're trying to give voice to the things that are important. And Elijah Cummings was a major person who did that. I think he was a champion for Baltimore.
That's a good word. I like champion. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. We also talked about Barack, and we kind of glossed over a little bit about how some of my classmates thought that he could have done more when he was in office, and it's the same kind of thing that we've been talking about of they're kind of, people expect a lot of them when I don't want to say there's only so much they can do, but it does kind of come down to that to a point. But I do agree that having them there is a big first step more than anything. But I like what you're saying about this. So what are your thoughts on Black Lives Matter fitting into political participation, since there's voting and then there's also protest? Black Lives Matter is kind of, I won't say it's died down because it still is an important topic, but I feel like it was 2016 to about probably 2017, 2018 was really the height of it. And then we kind of started to hear less and less about it. Would you still say that it's still a hot I won't say hot protest, but still a very important protest that's going on? And what do you think are the limitations of that as a protest?
Yeah, there are important books, that we could reference, but one of them is it's called "Protest is Not Enough," right? So that you need protest and organizing and voting, and on top of those things, you need resources, financial resources, right? But so protest is important. Protest gets attention, right? It brings attention to an overlooked concern that maybe has been lingering in a community for a long time. And when people organize protests, then they can get the attention of legislators and of decision makers, of policy makers. And so, and I think that that's what happened with Black Lives Matter. I think it's important to see that young people were saying we've had enough. The idea of police brutality and violence in black communities by police, by the state, is not new, and that has motivated protests over time. But in this particular case, it was black youth that said, or young people that said, we're gonna take our direct action campaign. We're gonna do some things differently. We're gonna hold a die-in. We're gonna block traffic. We're gonna be disruptive. Right? So this is more than marching.
For good reason.
Than some of the other things. Mm-hmm.
For good reason, yeah.
Right, right. But killing the police, brutalizing or killing unarmed black people is not a new thing. Mm-hmm. We know that, and people have been angry about it practically since the founding of the country, but certainly for more than 100 years, right? And we know that some of the biggest protests in black communities in the 60s were related to violence against unarmed blacks. But Black Lives Matter, I think, was an important, made an important contribution. So it's not that Black Lives Matter is going to end all police violence, but they did have people talking about it. They had the policymakers talking about this issue. They have presidential candidates and presidents talking about this issue. That counts, and we have seen some progress. We can despair. We can be, we can maybe be tempted to give up hope because not everything changes.